All right, guys. It looks like we have a good amount of people in here. I'm sure that more people are going to come in shortly, but we'll go ahead and get started right now. So welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Noah Goldberg. I am the Business Development Manager at KettleSpace. For those of you who don't know what KettleSpace is, we are a physical and virtual co-working space in New York City. This event was brought to light by the voices of our team and our community with the shared idea that we should use our platform as a place to affect change. This event will be the first of many like it. So in the spirit of co-authorship, we'll be asking for your advice and feedback in an email after the event. I'm extremely honored and proud to announce the host of this event, my beautiful, charming, knowledgeable Aunt Sebene Selassie. My Aunt Sebene Selassie is a renowned Brooklyn-based author, teacher, and speaker. So please, everybody, keep your microphones on mute. You'll have the option to ask some questions at the end, but thank you all so much for being here. And without further ado, I'll pass off the mic to my Aunt Sebene Selassie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you for having me. Thank you to KettleSpace. I'm Aunt Sebene. I invite you all to call me that now from now on. I'm really delighted to be here and explore this topic with you all around race, unconscious bias, and mindfulness. So we've been hearing a lot about race in the past few weeks and maybe even unconscious bias, but I really think that mindfulness is the missing ingredient in this conversation about our personal transformation around these charged issues. So I hope we have a good exploration today. I'll be sharing some information with you all, and there'll be time at the end for your input, questions. I'm really looking forward to that. I want to invite you in the spirit of mindfulness to really check in right now. I know how it is on Zoom calls. We can have many browser windows open. We can have multiple gadgets going on at once. And, we're all on our computers a lot these days. So I really want to invite you to start with this first lesson that mindfulness can teach us, which is multitasking is a myth. We're never really doing multiple things at once. We're just switching back and forth. And this conversation is about breaking patterns, breaking conditioning, and that happens through slowing down and bringing awareness. So really inviting you to bring your full awareness for the next hour to this conversation, to this exploration, to kind of let go of the technology besides just allowing yourself to receive for the next little while. Okay, so I am going to, so you don't have to just stare at my face for the next while. I'm going to be sharing my screen and sharing some slides with you as I go through some of this content. So give me a moment to do that. And I hope everyone can see my screen. So I just want to begin by honoring you all for showing up to this, yet another Zoom call, and one that is, not necessarily going to be comfortable in terms of looking at our own minds and our own biases. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about myself and my experience with this, and also just in terms of our culture, what's really going on. So this isn't necessarily a fun conversation. And for some of us, we've been having it for a long time. For some of us, we're newer to it. And it's about racism. Because race and racism are inextricably linked. And so I just want to invite us, even if it's uncomfortable, to recognize the freedom possible in kind of sitting in our discomfort and untangling some of the conditioning we do have, which is what mindfulness is all about. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself so that you know where I'm coming from. I am a trained Buddhist teacher. I teach in the Insight meditation tradition. I've been studying and practicing Buddhism for over 30 years, and I've been teaching for about 10. I'm an author and have a new book coming out at the end of August around belonging, called You Belong, where I really explore these issues of identity and difference and our interconnection and how our meditation practice can really help us with that. I've been teaching about these issues for many years, both as a meditation teacher and also in my work in social change and social justice. And I'm also a mindfulness teacher. I'm a featured teacher on the 10% Happier app with Dan Harris. And I also teach in various corporate settings for different companies, and now primarily online. I'm also Noah's aunt. And as someone who is not trained in necessarily social science around racial bias and unconscious bias, I am a Black woman. And so I have almost 50 years experience, which I consider my expertise. And growing up in this anti-Black racism of this country and really this world, that's the foundation of race as a concept itself. Having Black people in my life, including my nephews who are Black men, this conversation is particularly poignant and important one for me. And I'm going to be sharing today primarily around mindfulness as a tool, as I mentioned, to kind of hack unconscious bias. And I'm going to be sharing primarily about the healthcare world. There's been a lot of research done into bias in healthcare around race, which is helpful. It also kind of allows us to see the just pervasiveness of bias in our society, and racial bias particularly, and how it kind of undergirds everything: healthcare, education, real estate, the corporate world, so that we can see that it's not just about police brutality and bias in criminal justice. I'm also myself a 3-time cancer survivor. And I was diagnosed first with stage 3 breast cancer when I was 34. I've had 2 more times with stage 4 cancer, and most recently 5 years ago. And I'm doing well now, but I have experienced the effects of bias in healthcare itself, and so can speak directly to that. And it's not just about me experiencing bias, it's also me being part of unconscious bias, because we all are. And that's something that I really want to kind of emphasize today, is that we all have biases. We're looking at racial bias today and its horrific effects on our society, but bias is part of the culture. So I want to show us how fast and automatic and impulsive, ingrained, and habituated and patterned bias is. 95% of what we do is this automatic, impulsive system versus our slower, deliberative, reflective system, which mindfulness is a part of. And so just as we don't have to think about every action we do when we drive a car or walk down the street or make breakfast, we do want to slow down so that we can see how our conscious egalitarian goals don't necessarily line up with what our unconscious habits reveal. So this is a huge and almost unbearably complex topic, and we don't have a whole lot of time today. So I'm going to be going through a lot of information. Again, there'll be time at the end to ask questions and share. And I also just want to mention that because of the complexity of what we're talking about, I can't really talk about the whys of this very much, like why did this happen? We'd need kind of a multi-year seminar on the history of colonialism and race, and we'll talk a little more about how this shows up, again, in healthcare. And I'm also not looking at large structural or systemic issues. I'm a meditation teacher. What I know best is how to look at my own mind, my own heart, and start to affect change internally. And it's not that those structural issues, systemic issues, the whys are not important, but that's not what we're going to look at today. And, we can support our own understanding through reading and through studying if we're interested, but we'll be looking how implicit bias affects us personally, but how it operates in conjunction with structural realizations and structural racialization and structural institutions is something for another day for further exploration. So meditation is one way, mindfulness is one way for us to start to look at and affect change internally. Again, the work I do is from the inside out, and as my friend and teacher, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams said, without inner change, there can be no outer change. Without collective change, no change matters. So we're looking at inner change today because that is how outer change happens. Systems are made up of people. And so if we're asking or demanding in this moment change, that starts with us. Or as the great theorist Bell Hooks said, if you're effed up and you lead the revolution, you're going to have an effed up revolution. I really do believe that this work really starts from within, and that's how we'll affect change. So just again, honoring you for showing up for this conversation to look at that. So most of us are not explicitly racist or biased. You know, we have conscious values for equality and for kindness and for wisdom. I'm assuming all of us here have those conscious values of equality. But the unconscious, more than the conscious mind, actually controls our daily decisions and actions. Like I mentioned, those faster processing systems are how we survive in the world. 90% of our thoughts are really not original. We think the same stuff over and over. And research has uncovered time and time again that conscious egalitarian goals are undermined by deeply rooted implicit biases. So we can know that we're good people at heart. We're not carrying conscious bias. But if we only try to tackle bias at the conscious level, it won't help us. We'll continue to have killings, death, inequality, injustice. And this is a really, really important part to understand about unconscious bias. And it's going to sound repetitive, but I'm going to say it one more time. So listen carefully. Unconscious bias is unconscious. So a lot of people use the word implicit bias as well. I like to focus on unconscious bias because it really makes us understand that this is conditioning, this is programming, that we all have these hearts and minds that get shaped by the culture around us. But even when we put the name right into the term, we can still not understand this, still not internalize how these things have to be undone on a deeper level. We can know things on a conscious level, we can read about them, we can understand them, and we can still act out these implicit or unconscious ways of being. So this is Desmond Tutu, who is just a really powerful hero of mine for his joy and his resilience and his efficacy and his work as an anti-apartheid activist and a leader. And I read a quote from him years ago. Actually, I think I heard it on a radio interview. And I just want to share it with you. So he said that he went to Nigeria. He was working for the World Council of Churches. This was many years ago. And he was flying back to South Africa. And he got on a plane. And the two pilots in the cockpit were Black. He'd never seen Black pilots before. So he was just so excited. You know, he was so elated. He was just felt proud. And then they had a smooth takeoff, everything was going well, and then they hit what he called the mother and father of all turbulence. He said it was quite awful and scary. I can't believe it. But the first thought that I had was, hey, there are no white men in that cockpit. Are those Black men going to be able to make it? And of course they made it because here I am. And he said, I think that we have gravely underestimated the damage that apartheid inflicted on all of us. You know, the damage to our psyches, the damage that has made. I had not known that I was damaged to the extent of thinking that somehow actually what those white people had kept drumming into us in South Africa about our being inferior, about our being incapable, it had lodged somewhere in me. I find that quote and that sharing of that story by Desmond Tutu so powerful because it kind of relieves us to know that a man like him just so filled with kindness and wisdom, with joy and resilience. He too can acknowledge these biases and the culture shaping his really deeply seated ways of thinking about the world. I also use this quote partly to make myself feel better about what I'm about to share. So this is me and my older sister, Funnet. She's 4 years older than me. And Funnet is intellectually disabled. She can't read or write, and she has the intellectual level of a young child, even though she's probably more mature than me sometimes emotionally. I'm her legal guardian, but she lives in a wonderful community upstate where she has a really wonderful life. She works in a community workshop and lives in a household of other people like her, as well as non-disabled people. It's a beautiful place. So last year, she was scheduled to have surgery. And the day before her surgery, I went and stayed with her in the hospital overnight and stayed with her for a few days after. But it was her house leaders where she lives who took her to the pre-op appointments and interfaced with the doctor and the hospital leading up to the surgery. Funet's house leaders had told me they really liked the doctor, the surgeon they were working with, Dr. Laborde, because she said they said she was really sensitive and skilled, and she explained everything to Funnet in a way she could understand. So the day of the surgery, I was with Funnet here in the pre-op room and waiting for Dr. Laborde with other doctors and patients. And this was upstate. And so actually everyone in that pre-op room was white except for one Filipino nurse. Funet's anesthesiologist was white. The assisting surgeon was white. All of them came over and introduced themselves, really friendly and nice. And then Dr. Laborde walked in. So I knew Dr. Laborde is a woman because Nadej, Funet's house leader, had referred to her as that. But Dr. Laborde is a young, dark-skinned Black woman. And I didn't expect that. So I was perpetrating bias right there. You know, knowing that she was a doctor and a woman, that could have been a bias. Maybe if I didn't know, maybe I would have assumed she was a man, but less likely, I think. I've gotten used to having many female doctors myself through all my hospitalizations. But why did I assume that Dr. Laborde would be white? Because it was upstate? Because she was a surgeon? So, you know, that as a mindfulness teacher, as someone who teaches unconscious bias, I really had to take that moment of humility to realize that, yes, I have patterning that still needs to be unearthed and released. So the surgery went well, and Dr. Laborde came in and checked in on Funnet before she left, and she mentioned that she wouldn't be there the next day. It was a weekend, but her colleague, Dr. Grousseau, would be checking in on Funnet. She didn't gender Dr. Grousseau, so I didn't know what gender to expect. But once again, because everyone besides Dr. Laborde in the hospital I had come into contact with was white, I assumed that Dr. Grousseau would be white as well. So, of course, because this was going to be a weekend of humility for me, Dr. Grousseau walked in, and this is Dr. Grousseau. So why can't we live into our conscious values? And I'm asking myself, mindfulness teacher of unconscious bias, why can't you live into your conscious values? So Desmond Tutu's story, my story, many, many anecdotes. You may have remember the anecdotes from last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago now, but there are multiple anecdotes of Delta flights where Black female doctors on Delta flights attempting to attend to sick or distressed passengers were questions about whether they are in fact doctors. And eventually they were prevented from attending to those in need. These encounters are ridiculous. They're kind of the extreme of unconscious bias. But one thing that struck me about Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford, who's here pictured, that she showed the flight attendants her medical license, and they still did not believe her. That's how deep this conditioning can run in our culture and our society. And these are individuals who would not call themselves racist, not consider themselves consciously. They're not necessarily avowed white supremacists. They just cannot connect their unconscious conditioning to their conscious stated values. I offer as contrast a story my friend Lori, who is a mental health counselor in Massachusetts, told me that she had a white male client who was quite delusional, and he believed himself to be a medical doctor. And he went around everywhere proclaiming this. And guess what? He was always believed. No one once questioned him, asked him for ID, asked to see his medical license. It was just always assumed that, yes, he was a doctor. And studies show that this kind of bias also gets internalized. So oppressed and marginalized groups, people of color, Black people, will often anticipate bias. And this affects everything from their health, stress, creating all sorts of diseases and conditions, but also their own capacities. Because racism and oppression and bias gets internalized into what has been labeled stereotype threat and overcompensation. So the threat of being viewed through the lens of a negative stereotype, or the fear of doing something that would confirm the stereotypes that we swim in our society, those create so much stress that they affect people's outcome. The term stereotype threat was coined when researchers showed that Black college students performed worse on standardized tests than their white peers if they were reminded about their race before taking the test. And of course, for those of you who are people of color here or come from targeted marginalized groups, we don't need to be reminded of negative stereotypes. We swim in them. So we're constantly walking around with that sense of stereotype threat. You know, it leads to the phenomena of what hashtag Starbucks while Black, you know, buying a coffee even if you're waiting for someone because you know you might be targeted, experiencing being followed around a store. So being very careful where you put your hands. And I know people of color here can understand what I'm saying. And those conditions haunt us even beyond any shifts in class, neighborhood, location. Those are things that we experience on a daily basis. So you carry your medical license with you wherever you go, or if you're a large Black man like Questlove, you make yourself smaller to seem less threatening. Questlove wrote a beautiful essay after George Zimmerman's acquittal called Trayvon Martin and I Ain't Shit, about all of his experiences moving through different spaces and how people perceive and treat him. So I'd like you to take a moment just to check in, take a deep breath in, and maybe even close your eyes and just notice any sensations or feelings that are coming up right now with what I've shared so far. Just allowing whatever is present to be there. So mindfulness is all about paying attention on purpose to the present moment without judgment. Knowing that this starts to serve our self-understanding and our wisdom in the world. And it's a practice. It's something that we have to consciously choose to do so that we can affect change in our lives and in the world. And I find, again, mindfulness meditation, mindfulness practice, it gives us such a clear model for understanding the way our perceptions and beliefs are shaped moment by moment. When we sit and watch our minds, it's not so pretty. There's, just habitual worries and anxieties that run us and rule us. We get yanked around from here to there, but we slowly start to not need to push those away, not need to fix anything, but start to allow them to untangle themselves. And for me, I found that mindfulness is one of the best ways really to work with, again, unconscious bias and conditioning. So it takes the work of each of us to look at our own minds to do this. We're not going to practice so much today. I invite you to explore different practices. I'll mention some resources that connect mindfulness and race practice at the end. But I want to start by just reminding us that this is conditioning. We don't have to blame ourselves for our unconscious or implicit biases. We're all conditioned by the culture around us, as I've shared already. One of my favorite quotes is from the late spiritual teacher, Krishnamurti. He said, "You think you're thinking your thoughts. You're not. You're thinking the culture's thoughts." This is a really simple statement and such a profound teaching. Because when we beat ourselves up for how we are, we're having a fundamental misunderstanding about how our minds get shaped. We think that we have more control over our minds. We think that we spend maybe 95% of our minds in that relaxed and conscious space instead of the other way around. So I'd like to share a little bit more about these unconscious conditionings by starting with just understanding that race and racism are intertwined, inextricably connected. As the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates says, race is the child of racism, not the father. Because race as we know it today was invented around the 18th century to categorize different groups of people in order to justify the slave trade and colonialism. It has no scientific backing or reality. So as long ago, but not so long ago, the American Anthropological Association statement on race in studying cultures around the world is that there's more variation, actually most variation, 94%, is within racial groups, not between them. And sometimes it's hard if we don't know these facts, if we haven't studied this reality, to really grok that, right? Because we have been so conditioned to think of race as a real thing. But it's not. It was created so that people could feel better about enslavement, colonization, brutality, violence. Had to really categorize people as under and superior to really justify those actions. Because that brutality affects not only the oppressor, but the oppressed, but also the oppressor. So that kind of disassociation needed to happen in order to continue harming people like this. But there's still many people who don't understand this explicitly even. And then there are many more who implicitly buy into racial differences. So again, in my experience as a cancer patient, I did encounter people who did not know that these categorizations are not true, that they're based on skin color, geography, phenotype, or racial facial features. But there are many, many more people who implicitly buy into racial difference. So a 2016 University of Virginia study of medical students and residents found that a substantial number of white medical students and residents held false beliefs about the biological differences between Black and white people. So they thought that Black people age more slowly than whites, that their nerve endings are less sensitive than whites, that Black blood, whatever that is, coagulates more quickly than white blood, that Black skin is thicker than white skin. This is 2016, not 1916. That medical students do not understand that there aren't these hard and fast separation between racial groups, but still hold all these assumptions about differences that actually don't exist. So these are people who consciously reject stereotyping and prejudice, but they hold these unconsciously unfounded racist pseudoscientific beliefs. And again, most of us probably don't hold these scientific misunderstandings, but race is based largely on visual indicators, again, of skin color and phenotype. And that's what people are unconsciously reacting to. I always note, kind of the color of people of police brutality. And it's usually darker skinned Black people, not lighter skinned Black people. Research has explored the connection between criminal sentencing and Afrocentric feature bias, which refers to the negative judgments and beliefs that people hold regarding individuals who possess Afrocentric features, which is used to describe darker skin, a wider nose, fuller lips. And these researchers found that even when they were controlling for numerous factors, the seriousness of the primary offense, the number of prior offenses, that individuals with most prominent Afrocentric features received the longest sentences than their less Afrocentrically featured counterparts. So that's really deep conditioning. These are people in criminal justice who, really attest to the fairness of the law, the blindness of justice. But that conditioning really takes hold. And that conditioning is based on so much, that culture's thoughts are in us through years of media, through news, through what's projected around us, and through segregation, through the fact that most people of color and white people actually do not live together, do not socialize together, even if they're in the same workplace, they're actually not the same friend groups. And this is true across the races. So here's a few other things to consider based on research. When asked about unconscious bias, white doctors who claim no conscious bias demonstrated unconscious bias toward Black patients. So they were less likely to give life-saving drugs to people presenting with heart attack symptoms. White people were twice as likely as Black people to receive therapy for heart attacks. And these types of disparities are true for all interventions that they've looked at. There's been a lot of research into the underprescribing of pain medication to Black patients. They receive opioids for severe pain at 60% the rate of white patients. And their pain was reassessed less frequently. And I experienced this when I was hospitalized once with what was clearly an incident of appendicitis. I could feel that. And I wasn't being given any pain medication. I didn't understand why. I didn't really know a lot of this around pain medication administration to Black patients at the time, but I understood it much later when actually a doctor friend who works in an ER told me that often Black patients are perceived as drug seeking. And so this nurse, even though I'd been in that emergency room before for other issues, having been in emergency rooms many times over the years for cancer, she thought that I was probably seeking drugs for myself for addiction issues. But I was suffering for a long time until actually the surgeon came and said that I should be administered some pain medication. Even children with a clear diagnosis of appendicitis were studied, and they received opioids far less. Even if there was no concern about diversion of medication to addicted parents, that there was just the under treatment of their pain, which is so heartbreaking. All the lives that have been harmed or even cut short by this kind of unconscious behavior. And again, this is not just in the medical setting. So we see it very clearly with policing and brutality. Finally, many people who had not known this to the extent are having their eyes open to how this affects communities and people of color, and particularly, again, Black people being at the bottom of that hierarchy of race created as fiction. But it happens at the grocery store, it happens on public transportation. It's been shown that white people will not sit next to Black people and then later consciously rationalize that because the person didn't look friendly or there was more space over here. But across class and across other differences, that bias persists. And again, it's on an unconscious level, regardless what our conscious egalitarian ideas are about ourselves. So I've shared a lot. So I want to take another moment for you all to just check in. Notice where your attention goes when you close your eyes or just go inwards, to just consider this amount of information. Is it overwhelming? Is it illuminating? And just allow yourself to notice what's happening and just allow it to be there. That this is the beginning of a practice of mindfulness of our own experience. to know what our thoughts are, what our emotions are, what our reactions are. Because this conditioning is a lot. And to uncover it, it's not about doing, it's really about being with, so we can start to release these patterns. These patterns are revealed to us, and that's how they're released. It's not by knowing that they exist and then trying to do something about it on a conscious level. Especially if we're intelligent, smart, very research oriented, we might want to read a lot, and that's good. But I'm sure a lot of these doctors read a lot too. And so it's a moment by moment noticing of our patterns and starting to shift it by seeing them happening, because they're unconscious. They're not only unconscious in their action, they're often unconscious after the fact. So it's by noticing them that we'll start to change them. So mindfulness is so much about getting comfortable with discomfort. It's not the most comfortable thing to just sit in place and observe what's happening. And in our speedy culture, we're not used to that. Looking at this image of these people from around the world, and if any of you have traveled in other continents and other countries, many poorer places that might seem to be lacking, there's actually a great capacity for stillness, for just being, for awareness. So we have a lot to learn from each other in that diversity. And, for me right now, I'm actually really hopeful. I'm heartbroken, and it's important for me to bring my practice of mindfulness to that as well. But I'm also hopeful that things are not getting worse. They are getting uncovered, as Adrienne Marie Brown says. And we'll hold each other tight and continue to pull back this veil so that things that were unconscious become conscious, that things become revealed and released. So I want to do a little exercise with you to explore any biases that can be revealed. And they don't need to be huge biases of hatred, but I'm going to just scroll through some pictures of folks. And these are random pictures I found on the internet, so they're not supposed to signify any particular piece of news or information. And it's a whole diversity of people, because bias is not just about race. It can be about so many things, about gender, about size, about class. And we can have a lot of biases that we don't even know about. So just for a few minutes, we'll keep our attention on the screen. I'll flash some photos and just notice what thoughts come up, what perceptions, and maybe how you feel about those, not needing to change them or do anything about it, but just bringing this mindful awareness that is paying attention to the present moment without judgment, in service of self-knowledge and wisdom. So let's practice with these photos. So I've shared a lot with you all, and I hope that it's been helpful. We'll have some time now for some questions or sharing insights and comments. We're in such a powerful, potent moment of transformation and change. And I hope that we all can find ways to get engaged and make this meaningful. All of our futures depend on it. I'm very encouraged, and I hope you are too. There are so many resources out there. I know KettleSpace will be offering some other events and a book club and other things, but really our own process is internal, encouraging you all to check out some of these resources that connect mindfulness and meditation practice with unconscious bias and racism. Really looking at our capacity to recognize the stereotypes that we're buying into, the conditioning that we have to unwind. There's so many books and resources being shared right now, encouraging you to check out all the reading lists that are being shared. Just want to point out that James Baldwin showed up here twice because he's amazing. So please check out his work if you haven't before. His words still sing so true. He really was a prophet of his time. And if you want to check out my work, please check out my website. Maybe I should change it to auntsebeneselassie.com, but for now it's sebeneselassie.com, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Sebene Selassie. Thank you so much for your attention, for your presence, and we'll open it up now. I think you'll be able to unmute yourselves. If you have a question, maybe raise your hand and I can call on people.